Dane Ryloth stood on the cracked surface of Vextar 4, the thin atmosphere pressing against his suit like a ghostly shroud. The planet was a graveyard, no other word fit. Twisted remains of long-abandoned starships jutted from the desolate landscape like tombstones, their surfaces corroded by centuries of acidic winds. Even for a trader like Dane, accustomed to scavenging the forgotten corners of the galaxy, the scene was unsettling. "Just grab what you can and leave," he muttered to himself, the words muffled by his helmet's comm system. The outpost ahead was barely standing. Built of reinforced alloys now streaked with rust, its walls leaned precariously, as if ready to surrender to gravity's pull. Dane approached cautiously, his plasma torch humming as he carved through the warped entry door. Inside, the air was stale and heavy, illuminated only by the dim glow of his suit's headlamp. Shelves lined with dust-covered equipment stood untouched, but it wasn't the kind of treasure Dane sought. Most of it was standard issue, spare parts, rusted tools, scraps too degraded to be worth hauling back to the Velocis. He moved deeper into the outpost, past what might have once been a control room. The consoles were fried, their screens shattered. Then, in a corner obscured by debris, his headlamp caught a faint glimmer, a glint of something unnatural. Curiosity tugged at him like a tether. Dane pushed aside the rubble to reveal a small, smooth sphere. It was unlike anything he had ever seen. Black as void space, the artifact seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Faint symbols, intricate and alien, flickered across its surface like a dying heartbeat. "What the hell are you?" he whispered, reaching out hesitantly. The moment his gloved hand touched the sphere, a jolt shot through him, a sensation not of pain, but of overwhelming awareness. For a split second, Dane saw something, vast writhing structures suspended in a sea of endless darkness. The vision vanished as quickly as it came, leaving him disoriented and gasping for air. Against his better judgment, he slipped the artifact into his satchel. It wasn't greed this time, though the thought of the credits such a find could fetch had crossed his mind. It was the strange compulsion to keep it close. Back aboard the Velocis, Dane set the artifact on his workbench in the dimly lit cargo hold. The hum of the ship's engines was steady, a comforting backdrop as he examined his prize. "Scan this," he instructed the ship's AI, a rudimentary system named Navigator. The scanner whirred to life, beams of light playing across the artifact's surface. Then, abruptly, the system shut down. "Navigator?" Dane asked, frowning. The ship's lights flickered. A faint whisper, barely audible, drifted through the hold. It wasn't mechanical static. It sounded organic, alien. "I've been out here too long," Dane muttered, shaking his head. He reached for the artifact again, and as his fingers grazed its surface, the whispering stopped. The ship's lights returned to normal. Uneasy, he locked the artifact in a containment unit. Yet as he lay in his bunk later, sleep eluded him. His mind churned with fragmented images, unfamiliar stars, shadowy forms gliding through the darkness, and landscapes so alien they defied comprehension. The following day, Dane's unease deepened. The containment unit had malfunctioned overnight. The artifact now sat exposed on the bench, its symbols glowing faintly in the dim light. "You weren't doing that before," Dane said, keeping his distance. When he tried to move the artifact back into containment, a sharp pain shot through his hand. He yanked it back, finding no physical wound, but feeling an unshakable sense of violation. as though the sphere had touched more than just his flesh. The whispers grew louder as the hours passed. Dane began hearing fragments of language he couldn't understand, interspersed with strange, guttural tones that sent shivers down his spine. Worse, his body began to feel different. His skin tingled constantly, and the edges of his vision blurred in a way that made him question whether what he was seeing was even real. At one point, he thought he saw a figure in the cargo hold. Tall, spindly, with too many joints and a face that was more an absence than a form. He spun around, plasma pistol drawn, but the space was empty. The artifact sat on the bench, unmoving but somehow alive. By the third day, Dane's fear turned to desperation. He decided to jettison the artifact into space, to rid himself of the thing before its influence overtook him completely. Standing in the airlock with the sphere in hand, he prepared to eject it. As he opened the outer hatch, the ship's systems crashed entirely. The lights dimmed, the engines sputtered, and the gravity generators faltered, leaving him momentarily weightless. Then, the artifact pulsed, and a wave of energy threw him against the wall. When he regained consciousness, he was still in the airlock, the artifact resting undisturbed beside him. The hatch was sealed, the ship's systems restored, as though nothing had happened. But something had changed. When Dane stood, he felt lighter, almost as if gravity itself had lessened its hold on him. His reflection in the airlock's viewport startled him. His eyes, once a dull gray, now glowed faintly with an otherworldly light. The artifact's whispers were no longer faint. They spoke directly to him, their meaning just beyond his grasp. Dine Ryloth, a simple merchant, realized he was no longer the sole master of his fate. The Velocis drifted through the black, silent expanse of uncharted space, the stars distant and uncaring. Dane Ryloth slumped in the captain's chair, sweat beading on his forehead as he clutched his arm, where strange ridges had begun to form under his skin. They were faint at first, just subtle bumps he could feel more than see. Now they pulsed faintly with a dull, bioluminescent glow that flickered in rhythm with the artifact's strange hum from the cargo hold. He didn't know what was worse, the physical changes or the visions. Dine rubbed his temples as another flash overtook him, a jagged and violent image of a barren, windswept world under twin suns. Alien spires, twisted and organic, loomed like sentinels over a dead landscape. The vision was so vivid he could feel the heat of the suns burning his skin and taste the acrid metallic tang in the air. Then, just as suddenly, he was back aboard his ship, his heart racing, his breath shallow. "What is happening to me?" he whispered, his voice trembling. The artifact was doing this. He knew it. He had tried everything to isolate it: containment units, electromagnetic barriers, even a lead-lined crate he had scavenged from a derelict wreck. Nothing worked. The sphere remained where it wanted to be, its presence an immutable fact, like gravity. The changes in his body became impossible to ignore. The veins on his arms glowed faintly now, their pale blue light visible even through his sleeves. His muscles ached constantly, as if his body were being stretched and reshaped. Worse, his senses were betraying him. Sounds no longer came from their sources. He heard whispers in the vacuum of space, as though something were speaking to him from the stars themselves. Shadows danced in corners where there was no light, moving just out of reach before disappearing entirely. He thought he saw movement behind the viewport once, a sleek, spindly form gliding across the hull. But when he checked the exterior cameras, there was nothing there. The dreams were the worst of it. Each time Dane closed his eyes, he was transported to impossible places. He stood in the middle of alien ruins, their jagged geometry violating every law of physics he understood. He saw things, beings, moving in the distance, their forms indistinct but horrifyingly organic, shifting and pulsing as though their very existence was unstable. When he awoke, he often found himself in places aboard the ship he didn't remember going to. The cargo hold, the galley, even the airlock. Once he woke up clutching the artifact, its symbols blazing as his own body trembled in response. He had no memory of how he got there or why. It wasn't long before the transformations escalated. While performing a routine check in the engineering bay, Dane felt a sharp, searing pain in his left forearm. He collapsed against the wall, clutching his arm as the skin bubbled and split open. Blood, thick and dark, oozed from the wound, but beneath it, something else moved. He watched in horror as a thin, spiny appendage pushed out from under his skin. It was segmented, its surface glossy and black, glinting faintly in the low light. The thing twitched and writhed as though testing its new environment before retracting back into his arm, the skin closing seamlessly over it as if it had never been there. Dane stared at his arm, his breathing shallow. His body wasn't just being reshaped, it was being invaded. He staggered to the med bay, fumbling for his surgical kit. His hands trembled as he prepared to cut into his own arm, desperate to remove whatever was growing inside him. But the moment the scalpel touched his skin, a shock of electricity surged through his body, forcing him to drop the blade. The artifact's hum grew louder, vibrating through the walls of the ship. It was protecting him, or rather, it was protecting itself. Over the next several days, Dane's connection to the artifact deepened, whether he wanted it to or not. He found himself drawn to the cargo hold, standing over the sphere for hours without realizing how much time had passed. He stopped eating, his appetite replaced by a gnawing hunger he couldn't identify. His mind wasn't his own anymore. At one point, while examining the artifact in a desperate bid to understand it, he felt a strange sensation in his fingers. When he looked down, he realized they were no longer human. His fingertips had split open, revealing delicate, claw-like protrusions that flexed and curled unnaturally. They moved on their own at first, as though testing their capabilities, but when Dane focused, he realized he could control them, barely. A rush of alien knowledge flooded his mind. He knew things now, the composition of the artifact's material, the names of stars he had never visited, the patterns of growth for life forms he had never seen. But the more he learned, the less he felt like himself. Then came the first real message. Dane was in the cockpit, staring blankly at the star field ahead, when the whispers became coherent. "Dane Ryloth," the voice said, low and guttural, but unmistakably speaking his name. He jumped from his seat, spinning around. "Who's there?" "You carry us." The voice wasn't coming from any one direction. It was everywhere, vibrating through the very structure of the ship. "What do you want?" he demanded, his voice breaking. "To return," the voice replied. "To become whole, you will bring us." Dane backed away, shaking his head. "No, I'm not your pawn. Get out of my head." But the whispers didn't stop. Instead, they grew louder, overlapping, a cacophony of alien voices chanting in unison. Dane screamed, clutching his head, as his vision blurred and his body convulsed. When he came to, he was on the floor of the cargo hold. The artifact was glowing, its light pulsating in sync with his own heartbeat. He looked down at his hands. They were no longer hands. Long, spindly fingers with jointed claws extended from his wrists, twitching involuntarily. His skin had become translucent in places, revealing shifting patterns of bioluminescence beneath. Dain stared at himself in horror. He was no longer fully human. And the worst part? A small, insidious part of him didn't care. The Veloci's emerged from hyperspace into the void hollows, a region of space whispered about in fringe trader circles as a place of death and secrets. The asteroid belt stretched before Dain like a vast, chaotic graveyard, the rocks jagged and angular, each one spinning lazily in the cold darkness. The ship's proximity sensors chirped nervously as the debris field grew denser. "This is where it ends," Dain murmured, his voice hoarse and ragged. His reflection in the viewport barely resembled the man he once was. His skin shimmered faintly, its texture resembling the surface of the artifact. His eyes glowed softly, their irises fractal and alien. His arms, once muscular and steady, had become elongated and sinewy, the claw-like appendages at the ends flexing and curling involuntarily. His humanity was slipping away with each passing moment, but he had to keep going. The artifact hummed faintly from the bench in the cockpit, its glow pulsating faster now, as though excited. It had guided him here, its whispers forming clearer words as he neared his destination. "Return, return to the source," the voice had said, over and over, an unrelenting mantra that refused to leave his mind. Dain maneuvered the ship into the asteroid field, weaving through the jagged rocks. The scanners were useless, distorted by the strange electromagnetic interference emanating from the belt. But Dain didn't need them. He could feel the location of his destination, as though a tether bound him to it. As he approached, the asteroids thinned, revealing a massive structure embedded within a moon-sized rock. It was ancient and alive all at once, a grotesque amalgamation of organic and mechanical elements. Its surface pulsed with faint light, its shape a nightmare of non-Euclidean angles and shifting geometry that hurt Dain's eyes if he stared too long. The entity's temple. Landing on the surface was easier than expected. The ship almost seemed to guide itself, as though the artifact had taken control. When the Velocis touched down on a smooth expanse near the structure, Dain felt an overwhelming sense of dread and inevitability. The airlock hissed open, and Dain stepped out into the oppressive atmosphere of the temple. He didn't need his helmet anymore. His body had already adapted to the thin alien air. The surface beneath his feet was warm and pliable, like flesh stretched over bone. The structure loomed ahead, its entrance a gaping maw that seemed to breathe faintly. "Here," the voice whispered, clearer than ever. "Inside." Dain approached, his claws twitching involuntarily. As he entered the temple, the air grew thick and humid, the walls pulsating with faint, organic light. The interior was a labyrinth of twisting corridors, each one lined with fleshy, sinewy material that seemed to move of its own accord. And then he felt it, a presence vast and overwhelming. It wasn't just in the air, it was in his mind, in his blood, in every cell of his body. It was the entity, the thing that had been reaching across the void through the artifact. The chamber at the heart of the temple was enormous, its ceiling stretching so high it disappeared into darkness. In the center, suspended by tendrils of pulsating flesh, was the entity. It was unlike anything Dane had ever seen. Its form was massive and amorphous, shifting constantly as though it couldn't decide what shape to take. Eyes, hundreds of them, opened and closed across its surface, some human, others entirely alien. Limbs sprouted and retracted, each one covered in writhing tendrils. Its skin was translucent in places, revealing pulsating organs and shifting patterns of light. Dane froze, every instinct in his body screaming at him to run, but the artifact pulsed in his satchel, and the entity's voice filled his mind. "Welcome, host," it said, its voice a symphony of tones that reverberated through the chamber. What are you?" Dane managed to ask, his voice trembling. "I am what you call an entity," it replied. "A fragment of what was once whole, scattered across the void, waiting to be reborn." Dane clutched his head as the words poured into his mind, accompanied by images. An ancient civilization, long gone, whose hubris had led them to summon this being. The entity had consumed them, fractured itself to spread across the stars, and embedded pieces of itself into artifacts like the one Dane had found. You've infected me," Dane said, his voice rising in anger and fear. "You are becoming," the entity corrected. "Through you, I will return." The realization struck him like a blow. He wasn't just a victim. He was a vessel, a host for the entity to rebuild itself. "No," Dane said, shaking his head. "I won't let you." "You cannot resist," the entity said, its voice cold and final. "You are mine." Dane's body betrayed him as he fell to his knees, his limbs convulsing. The changes accelerated, his claws extended further, his skin split open to reveal glistening alien tissue beneath. His breathing grew labored as he felt his body stretching and reshaping. But somewhere deep inside, a spark of defiance remained. Dane reached for the artifact, now glowing so brightly it hurt to look at. He understood now. It was the source of his transformation, but it was also the key to stopping the entity. Using the last of his strength, he staggered to his feet and stumbled toward the artifact's pulsing core. He pressed his claws into its surface, feeling the raw energy surge through him. The entity screamed, a deafening roar that shook the temple. "You would destroy me?" it bellowed. "You would destroy us?" Dane didn't answer. He focused all his willpower, channeling the artifact's energy back into the temple. The walls began to collapse, the organic material shriveling and blackening. The entity lashed out, tendrils whipping through the air, but Dane pressed harder, feeling his own body breaking under the strain. He was becoming something monstrous, but he didn't care anymore. "If I go, you go with me," he whispered. With a final surge of energy, the artifact exploded in a blinding flash of light. The chamber disintegrated, and the entity's scream faded into silence. When the light faded, the temple was gone, reduced to ash. The Velocis lay in ruins, its hull scorched and broken. Dane's body was unrecognizable, a twisted amalgamation of human and alien. But as he lay there, staring up at the endless stars, he felt a strange sense of peace. For the first time in weeks, the whispers were gone, and so was the entity. The void was silent, save for the faint hum of the artifact's remnants, scattered like glowing embers across the scorched remains of the temple. Dine Ryloth lay sprawled on the surface, his body broken, twisted, and alien, his breath rattling in a chest that no longer felt like his own. His eyes, still fractal and glowing, blinked up at the infinite expanse of stars above. His war against the entity should have been over. He had felt the explosion tear through the temple, shattering the pulsing, fleshy walls and collapsing the labyrinth. He had heard the entity scream, an unholy cacophony of rage, despair, and fear, as the artifact's energy surged back into it, consuming everything. But as he lay there, surrounded by ash and the sickly remnants of the temple, he knew the truth. It wasn't dead. The whispers began again, faint but unmistakable, threading through his mind like strands of dark silk. "You cannot destroy me, dying Ryloth," the voice said. It no longer bellowed or roared. It was calm, almost serene, but it carried an undercurrent of triumph. "You have only severed one part of me. I am infinite, eternal. And now, so are you." Dain groaned as he tried to move, his body responding sluggishly. His once human limbs no longer obeyed him fully. Tendrils emerged from his arms, extending and retracting like curious serpents. His skin shimmered faintly, a patchwork of human flesh and alien material. He wasn't just a host anymore. He was something in between. "Get out of my head," he hissed, his voice raw and barely audible. "I am not in your head," the voice replied. "I am in your blood, your cells, your very essence." Diane pushed himself upright, his claws scraping against the warm, fleshy ground. The remains of the artifact pulsed faintly around him, their light dimming as the energy dissipated into the temple ruins. Ahead, a new structure loomed, vast and incomprehensible, a writhing mass of shifting shapes and glowing tendrils. The entity. It was still here, reduced but not destroyed, its form a pale echo of what it had been. "You sought to destroy me," it said, its voice emanating from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Yet here you are, still bound to me, still alive because of me. You cannot escape what you've become." Dane stumbled forward, each step a battle against his treacherous alien body. His claws twitched involuntarily, and his vision blurred as flashes of other worlds assaulted him. Sprawling alien cities, desolate wastelands, endless oceans of shifting color. He could feel the entity's memories merging with his own, blurring the line between what was his and what was not. "I won't let you win," he rasped. "You still believe this is a war you can fight?" the entity asked, its tone almost amused. "Dain Ryloth, you are no longer a mere human. You are something more, something greater. Accept what you are becoming, and I will give you knowledge beyond imagining." Dain froze. The whispers grew louder, and with them came images. Galaxies teeming with life, vast civilizations stretching across the stars, secrets of the universe laid bare. He saw things no human could comprehend, patterns in the chaos of existence, answers to questions no one had dared to ask. The temptation was intoxicating. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Only what I have always wanted," the entity said. "To become whole. Through you I can extend myself once more, spreading across the void, touching every world, every life. And in return I will make you my emissary, my chosen. You will see all that I see, know all that I know. You will transcend." Dane's claws flexed involuntarily, his alien senses picking up the vibrations of the entity's form. It wasn't lying. He could feel its promise vibrating through his very cells. The knowledge, the power, it was all there, within reach. But then he thought of the visions he had seen during his transformation. The barren worlds, the lifeless ruins of civilizations consumed by the entity's spread. He thought of the alien faces, twisted in agony as they were reshaped and repurposed. "You destroy everything you touch," he said, his voice firmer now. "Destruction is a perspective," the entity replied. "I bring unity, evolution, a galaxy without division, without chaos. A galaxy without freedom," Dain spat. "A galaxy where nothing is left but you." The entity was silent for a moment. Then it spoke, its tone colder, sharper. "Then choose, Dain Ryloth. Accept me and live forever as part of something greater, or defy me and be erased." Dain stood at the threshold of the entity's mass, his body trembling as the whispers reached a crescendo. He could feel his own mind slipping, fragments of his identity breaking away like ice from a melting glacier. But somewhere deep within him, a memory surfaced, faint and fragile, but enough. A memory of himself before all of this, a simple merchant scraping by on the fringe of the galaxy. A man who had once believed that survival meant holding on to his humanity, no matter the cost, and he knew what he had to do. "I choose," he said, his voice steady, "to end this." With a final surge of strength, Dain reached deep within himself, tapping into the remnants of the artifact's power that still pulsed in his veins. He felt the entity recoil, sensing his intent, and it lashed out, tendrils of flesh and light whipping toward him. But Dain was faster. He drove his claws into his own chest, piercing through the alien tissue that had taken root there. Pain, unlike anything he had ever known, shot through him, but he didn't stop. He reached deeper, his claws finding the pulsing core of the transformation, the link between him and the entity. "No!" the entity roared, its voice shaking the very ground beneath him. "You will die!" "Better me than everyone else," Dain growled through gritted teeth. With one final pull, he tore the core free. Light erupted from his chest, searing and blinding as the connection between him and the entity was severed. The temple shuddered, the walls collapsing inward as the entity's form disintegrated. Its screams echoed through the void, growing fainter and fainter until they were gone entirely. When the light faded, there was silence. Dain lay on the ground, his body broken and fragile, the last remnants of the alien transformation fading from his skin. He was human again, or what was left of him. The stars above seemed brighter now, unfiltered by the presence of the entity. For the first time in weeks, the whispers were gone. He smiled faintly, his breath shallow. "I won," he whispered to the emptiness, and as the last traces of the temple crumbled around him, Dain Ryloth closed his eyes and let the void take him. The stars watched, silent and eternal,